Welcome everybody and good afternoon. Great to see so many PCN and practice colleagues here on the webinar today. This is a webinar that's being jointly run between the Well-led provider, MIAB and Hempsons, and we're delighted that so many of you could make it. I'll start with a very quick bit of housekeeping. The chat tab is open, so feel free to put questions in there. And Gary, my colleague who will introduce himself in a moment, will do his best to answer the questions as they keep coming in, but he will also run a quick question and answer session at the end with all of the panel to answer any questions that he hasn't answered so far. If you struggle to use the chat, you could use the Q&A box instead, but as a preference, could you try to use the chat box just so he only has to have one thing open in front of him. And this is being recorded, and the link to the recording as well as the slide deck will be emailed to everyone who's attended, as well as everyone else who registered but wasn't able to attend. So no need for anyone to make copious notes. So what we're going to cover today in this session is a little bit about the legal considerations of incorporation, and Hempsons will cover that off for us. We'll then move across to MIAB and their team to talk about the risks that an incorporated PCN could be exposed to. And then in whatever time there's left, I will talk a little bit about the CQC considerations for incorporated PCNs and how the Well-led provider platform can help with that. So on to some introductions. I'm Dr. Claire Sieber. I'm a practicing GP and I'm based down in West Sussex. I'm a mediator of GP partnership and PCN disputes for my sins, and I also run the Well-led provider. I'll ask Gary to introduce himself next.
Hi, I'm an associate of the Well-led practice. I support practices and PCNs, and this morning supporting the GP Federation with a variety of different projects. I was a practice manager and PCN board member for, well, nearly 13 years, well, in practice anyway. Monty?
Hello everybody, my name is Montrose Bill. I'm the medical malpractice manager for MIAB. We work across the general medical, dental, optical and pharmaceutical sector. At the moment we quote everything general practice. And we also actually offer cover for individual healthcare practitioners and their businesses. Over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Monty. So yes, my name is Robert McCartney. I am a solicitor at Hempsons, specialised in primary care and part of the primary care team here at the firm. I will be starting off the session by looking generally at the kind of legal considerations and the benefits that may arise from going through an incorporation process. I've got a lot to cover off. There's a lot of technical issues here and lots of bits which independently they could take an hour session at least. But hopefully this will give you a kind of a flavouring of some of the factors that need to be kind of considered when you are looking at incorporation. And in fact, if you are incorporated already, and I believe we have got some colleagues on here who have already taken that step, kind of thinking through, well, have you considered some of these specific issues and the technical points that come up? So there's very quickly, you can see the agenda. I'll be working through each of these points and we'll move on to the next slide with the first kind of key question of what does an incorporation actually look like? Now, the term incorporation in the context of PCNs is often actually used to say we have incorporated or we want to incorporate our PCN. But to be really clear on this, the PCN itself does not get incorporated. The PCN is a kind of contractual relationship that's driven by the DES from NHS England, in which the practices in any given area should work collaboratively together to deliver services, and has been since 2019, as I'm sure most of you will be aware. It is governed by the network agreement, and that is the kind of core contractual relationship between the practices. So when we're talking about incorporation, what we are kind of focusing on is the formation of a company that the PCN practices can use to help with structuring and delivering different elements of the DES. It effectively is a completely separate entity but is integrated and works, almost as one with the rest of the PCN. We'll go into a bit more detail about how you structure it in a moment, but it's really important to bear that in mind, that whilst you have incorporated, and if you've incorporated, the PCN as it currently is still exists. It is still that kind of key relationship-driven kind of connection between the practices within their PCN. As you can see from this diagram, once you've actually incorporated a company, you will need a number of directors who are actually running it, and they are often appointed through the practices themselves. You also need contractual relationships between the practices and the company, because that is the bit that actually creates the legal relationship between you. As I say, if you think of them as two separate entities, you need that kind of binding connection, and that's often in the form of a contract to help the flow of responsibilities and the flow of funding. It doesn't replace the network agreement. Often the network agreement needs to be amended to reflect the fact that you have got one of these companies in place. Come to the next slide, please. So, why would you have a new company, and what is its role? Three kind of broad categories of why you might have a company, and all of them are designed on the basic principle of you're protecting the practices and you're isolating the risks that are faced by the practices of different types. And there are three kind of broad categories of how these companies are developing. The first is actually as a service delivery company. So this is a company that's fully established to be able to provide your PCN services and any other services that need to be delivered within the primary care network spec or from separate contracts. The second is as a holding company. And this is where you might hold a number of contracts on behalf of the practices so that the practices aren't directly liable, especially important if you're a partnership and you don't want to potentially have the liability directly towards you. You can put a contract in a holding company. Now, that may not actually deliver any services, but what it might do is manage the relationship with subcontracted providers. So you might have a whole range of other providers actually delivering the service, but you use this company to hold contracts and to manage the governance between them. And then the third category is often the cost-sharing group. Now, a cost-sharing group is a fairly complex concept designed to designed to limit the risks associated with VAT. I'm not intending to go into great detail about VAT because that's a kind of a topic on its own, but depends on how you structure relationships and structure the employment roles of individuals. You could, as a PCN, be facing a VAT liability. And by having a cost-sharing group that isn't necessarily a service delivery company, you could isolate some of that risk and say, actually, by using the protections provided by HMRC, we are delivering services across our practices as a key kind of isolated group, and that gives you from various protections from VAT. Next slide, please. So I talk about whether or not they are, at the extent to which they are incorporated and work together. And generally, there's two ways that most PCNs have developed their companies. They can either have it as an arm's length approach, where you have a PCN board that is separate from the PCN company. They would have a kind of commissioner contractor style relationship. So the PCN would effectively just manage the contract, get oversight, make certain there's governance, and they have that degree of separation for you. The benefit of doing that is it allows that degree of independence to grow, and it also allows further assurance that things are being done in a very open and transparent way. The downside is it creates an extra level of bureaucracy, and it's an extra level of kind of duplication potentially if it's not structured in the right way. The alternative is fully integrated, where the PCN company and the PCN, despite the fact they are separate entities, as I've stated earlier, you amalgamate it as much as possible. So it's the same, the board's directors are going to be the same individuals who are also the PCN decision makers. You have one set of governance, one set of oversight. They are legally distinct, but practically indistinguishable. So that cuts down a lot of the bureaucracy side of it. But it can lead to kind of questions about the level of independence between the companies if should any dispute arise in the future. The one which is best for you really does depend on your specific circumstances and the relationships between the individual practices. Next slide, please. So get into more detail about where some of these risks sit. The first is workforce issues. Now, for those of you who remember 2019, one of the big announcements that was part of primary care networks was, of course, the additional roles reimbursement scheme. And this idea there'd be all this additional funding that comes through related to be able to recruit particular staff. Great in principle, everybody's got their own views on the R's roles, but fundamentally the ability to put in large amounts of money into services in primary care to help have additional workforce was well received as a concept, and I believe in most places have been well implemented. The problem that arose in 2019 was, well, who actually employs these individuals? Are they who's therefore going to be responsible for them? Who's going to be the individuals who are who's going to be their managers, and ultimately who's going to develop the culture that actually makes it an attractive place to work within the primary care network? What often happened in the early days in particular is individual practices would take on that responsibility. So one practice might take on multiple individuals, others might have split between them. That created a liability on that practice to be the employer. And whilst that was only small numbers, that wasn't so much of an issue. Now we are talking about large numbers of staff and potentially kind of staffing revenues of close to 7 figures. With regards to setting up a company, then you can then choopy that staff into that workforce into a defined entity that removes that liability and limits the liability and risk from the practices into the company. You also got a defined entity for which you can develop a culture, a workforce, a management team, and all the other trappings of having your own delivery entity or holding company, depending on how you structure it. You do need to consider pension access, and that was a major issue up until NHS England published a defined subcontract. Ever since that's been in place, as long as you complete it correctly, you can secure pension rights for that workforce once they move into these teams. But it's, again, a standalone topic. Happy to advise on that if it's required at a later time. Okay, next slide, please. With regulators and compliance, now Claire will go into more detail about the CQC side of things, but if you are being a provider company and actually want to be responsible for delivering the services, you do need CQC registration. You're also likely to need your data security and protection toolkit compliance so that you can obtain your ODS code and NHS mail access and information commissioner office registration. There may be other forms of regulators and compliance depending on the services that you want to deliver, but these are the kind of key ones. So again, as a standalone entity, if you've incorporated it, it needs its own independent confirmation that it's got all its compliance undertaken. You can rely to some extent on your practices, but that depends on the contractual relationship between them and the extent to which they cross-indemnify each other to make sure that they are compliant. So if you've got your own standalone entity, at least you can control that kind of collectively. Next slide. So looking at contracting arrangements, there are generally 2 types of contracts. There's the revenue and then there's expenditure contracts. Revenue contracts currently, if you're not incorporated, are going to be flowing into the practices or into the one practice that you've nominated as the lead. And again, it puts a lot of obligation on that practice. It could be multi-millions pounds now. By having a separate entity, you can control it by going into the same entity and say, we are controlling all the revenue in. And it allows you to potentially expand your revenue into contracts with other commissioners, potentially entrepreneurial services, maybe commissioners' arrangements with social services, for example, or with local charities, especially as the relationship with the INTs, the integrated neighbourhood teams, kind of mature. Expenditure contracts can then also be isolated into this set team, set entity, so that it's not split across or held primarily by a single practice. These entities do need to have good governance. Most governance is outlined as a starting point in your network agreement and the Articles of Association as an entity. Network agreement for the PCN, Articles of Association for the incorporated company. The clinical side should be covered by your CQC. You should have good financial governance, which might be detailed in network agreement, but you might also want to have things such as SFIs and standing orders for instructions to decide what can be spent when, how you monitor it, where it's tracked. And corporate governance for decision making. This is the area we see probably the biggest number of kind of fallouts, really, is where people are not open with their decision making. It's not clear how that's being made. And you almost add an extra level of complexity by having an incorporated vehicle, because it's another entity. That's why you've got to make certain you structure it appropriately so that the right decisions are made by the right people in an open, transparent way to protect your PCN. The next part is collaborative working. Now, this is the big push in the latest version of specification. There's a requirement to work with your INTs. There's a requirement to develop far better relationships with others outside of the PCN. The question is, who is it that's actually providing it? Is it the individual GPs, the PCNs? Is it some sort of integrated group? If we look at the next slide, inevitably it falls onto GPs. That kind of disconnection does result in problems with collaborative working because people don't know who to talk to and when to talk to them. So again, a PCN incorporated vehicle does potentially offer a solution, because on the next slide we'll see it's a single voice and a single entity representing those the PCN and the practices. And I think this is an area that has a particular strong benefit going forward as we move into the world of INTs. Now, I appreciate I have really done a quick whistle-stop tour of all of this because of the time that we've got, but I can happily answer any further questions during the FAQ, and I can be contacted at a later time to discover it. Hopefully that gives a little bit of a flavour of some of the key areas to look into. I think I'll hand over to Monty.
Thank you very much, Rob. Okay, so as I say, we're specialists in the general medical market. So we quote all things general practice. We actually insure over 2,000 general practices at the moment, and PCNs has become one of our large focuses. So we've been dealing with PCNs now since 2019, obviously since their evolution, moving away from the flat practice, lead practice and super partnership models. What we've seen is a lot more PCNs which are actually incorporated over the last 18 months. These are generally the type of PCNs which we see. Rob touched upon this earlier on. I think the mix, if you look at the bottom two, is really generally what we see. A PCN who's actually going to be CQC registered, who's got underlying GP practices with them, or a PCN is going to be acting as a contract vehicle available to actually employ staff. So it's going to take a bit of time just to run you through the key concerns of a PCN when somebody actually contacts us. We tend to sit people down, ask them what their concerns are, what kind of business they are. They come in all different shapes and sizes. So these are three key areas which they'll often tell us about. So when it comes to the management, we see that the management is normally made up of a GP, a partner from each of the underlying GP practices, maybe a finance officer, compliance officer, and a non-exec director. They're taking important decisions on behalf of the business, dealing with things like governance, strategy, protocols, ensuring that staff are actually properly credentialed as well, really well trained to undertake the services. So as you can see, there's a lot actually going on there. So you need to ensure that you've got adequate protection in place. Similarly, with your contracts, they're bidding for key contracts as well. We see every practice actually takes a DES contract. Outside of that, you'll have an enhanced access service. In addition, you might have some key community care contracts as well. So how is that actually being distributed amongst your practices? In terms of legislation, there's over 4,000 pieces of legislation as well, which you need to be aware of, and that's changing all the time. So you need to have an excellent policy in place to make sure you can mitigate any risks which are directed in your area. I'll give a brief example of a large PCN who we had recently, whereby they were contacted by the ICB, and they were actually told that they'd overpaid in terms of funds. So what we had to do is get involved, a specialist solicitor, to actually look over their accounts to ensure that they can be assisted in that. So the kind of policy that you would actually require there would be professional indemnity. Also, in respect of the first part, when you look at the management team, as they're directly responsible for the decisions they take on behalf of the business, they can be held liable for their decisions. So the kind of cover you would actually need there would be management liability, which actually incorporates your directors and officers cover, company legal liability, and employment practices liability, which I'll touch on again in a moment. So we mentioned the actual R's roles earlier on, Rob did, and essentially that's the funding that you get from the NHS to actually get your staff in. When PCNs actually contact us, it's one of the key areas that they actually talk to us about, how we're actually going to protect our staff. Obviously, they've been relying on a surgery policy, but because of the type of services which you're actually going to be doing, the cover that you'll require is going to be above and beyond that. So it's vital to understand that the services you do are actually different, and they're not your standard APMS, PMS, and GMS contracts. They'll be in addition to that. You're sharing staff across your network. You need to ensure that you've got the right practices and protocols in place. And it's also a prerequisite that any limited company, you must actually have your own employer's liability cover in place, and your public liability will actually sit alongside that. So as you can see, each area of the business has a knock-on effect on the other. And a claim can actually come from anywhere, but it all depends on where it's actually attached to. So I could give a brief example of that. If you had a locum member of staff, for instance, who was doing out of hours, you need to ensure, have they been properly risk assessed? You need to ensure, have they got the right PPE in place? A claim can easily arise as a result of that. They could say that, the risk assessment didn't happen, put a claim into the business. That would actually be attached to the company legal liability side of things. In terms of if they had suffered a basic injury at work, that's your employer's liability. And obviously, if they say were pregnant, for instance, God forbid, they could actually say they were discriminated against as well. So those are all the kind of things that you need to look at when thinking about picking up cover. So what we've actually done is we've gone out to an insurer and we put together our own specialist policy. And these are what we think are the core covers which will actually be required by a PCN. So you've got your management liability starting at the top. That's going to cover you for the day-to-day management of a business. As I said, it includes things like directors and officers, your company legal liability, and employment practices liability. It will pay for any legal defence costs in the event of an allegation of wrongdoing. That could be directed at any member of staff, anyone who's in a position of responsibility. It will pick up the company legal liability, which is something which is directed directly at the business. And then you've got your EPL, which is the employment practices liability as well. And that's really a violation of employee rights, and that will come in any shape or form. I'm going to take a little bit of time just to discuss professional indemnity. Professional indemnity is often thought of as medical malpractice cover, but in this situation, as you're actually going to be undertaking work which is in line with a primary care contract, any treatment or clinical negligence, bodily injury as a result of treatment will be protected by CNSGP. So professional indemnity in this instance is really for the more of the management consultant side of the business. It's covering your professional service and any financial loss as a result of that. Again, I'll give a case in question where we've had a large PCN who operate a volatile patient service. The actual patient himself was unhappy that he could actually visit his own practice, was directed to another practice, still in the local community. He was unhappy with that, cited stress, cited the fact that he'd become further ill and wanted to claim for compensation. by having a PI policy, you're actually able to mitigate that risk and avoid any kind of lengthy litigation. So that was able to be batted away. I'd also add, if you're going to become CQC registered, when you look at your contract, you may well find that PI or professional indemnity is actually a contract requirement. In respect of employers' liability, it's important to understand the services that you're actually doing. Again, you cannot rely on your standard GP practice cover there. You're acting under the auspices of a PCN. You'll actually be on the payroll maybe of a PCN as well. Therefore, that policy won't suffice. What we've seen is a lot of PCNs who are actually taken on staff, the likes of social prescribers, your GPs, pharmacists, paramedics, mental health care practitioners, all offering care in the community. So you do need specialist cover for that as well. Often if you're leasing space in the public domain, your local council may actually ask you for increased limits of liability. So rather than having a 1, 2, you would often have to have a £10 million limit of indemnity there as well. So for property, we're aware that the PCNs or the limited company itself, they don't actually own their own premises, so may just be operating out of the lead practices. So generally what we tend to see here is a request for cover in terms of personal effects that might be computers, telephony, laptops. But often we can also see practices where a practice in your community have actually lost their contract and are being taken over by the PCN as well. So if you are responsible for that, we can get that added to the policy. Now, in terms of what cover do you actually need, how much cover, we would actually recommend that you do take the core covers. And the reason being, your claims are often overlapping, and they can arise quickly. They can happen frequently, but if by having the main covers in place, you don't need to worry about having to go out and take multiple policies. Everything's there, and it's a policy which will actually cover every eventuality. So plug in any gaps in your cover. So what else do you need to know? There are additional covers that we do say you should consider. If you look at clinical indemnity, I did touch on that earlier on. This is what I'm referring to here is you may require additional cover in things which are not covered by CNSGP. So that these could be services which are paid for. This could be any kind of private work you do, or anything which is a non-standard contract. You would require an additional medical malpractice cover for that as well. And that's something which we can actually supply for you. In terms of cyber liability, it's actually quite apt. Being what happened in the London hospitals on Tuesday. It's a little bit of a misnomer that the NHS look after your cyber liability. They don't. They provide you with a system, or they house a system which allows you to access medical patient records. The actual security behind that is normally done by a third-party company. So what you'll see, you're relying on somebody else to actually protect you when they're not actually going to be doing that. A cyber liability policy will pay for so much more. It will pay for any kind of third-party damage, fraudulent behaviour from any information that's been taken, defamation, and basically it'll be a first point of contact for you to actually contact anyone who's been affected by a data breach, and the big one being their data breach. You're in this instance, you would be deemed the data controller. So that's really something to think about. And what we're aware of, the majority of data breaches don't happen by technology, it's done by personal error. Okay, so that's really a whistle-stop tour of the kind of cover that would actually be required. There's probably a lot to think about and a lot I didn't touch upon, but we've got an expert team in-house. As I say, we typically set aside time to sit down with our clients and talk about the right cover which you require. We've already covered over 100 PCNs in the UK who have been incorporated, currently working with 15 more now. I'm sure Ben Philippe and A1 would be happy for you to contact them to get some sort of feedback on how they felt they were dealt with. But I think if you want to take something away from this, it will be that PCN cover is actually complex. and overlapping. And when I say that, a claim could, you may think a claim would actually attach to maybe employer's liability, but it may end up being another area of cover where you would need that assistance. So feel free to contact us. Look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much. I'll pass you across to Claire.
Thank you, Monty. Thank you for all of those sort of real world examples that put it right into perspective and why it's so important to make sure we're covered and we get some expert opinion about what it is that we need to cover exactly, because it's so complex, like you say. I'm just going to touch now a little bit on the CQC considerations and how the Well-led provider platform can help with that. And Rob has already touched on some of this, but you are required to be registered, not to be in the process of registering, but to be registered before a PCN company can deliver any clinical contracts such as the services under the DES. And there is a long wait at the moment, like he said. I think I was quoted even longer recently, Rob. I was told 8 months, but it's a long time. So it's worth making sure you're aware of that when you're thinking about how quickly you're actually going to be able to do some of the things that you want to do. And the CQC conveniently now have a new framework. Inconvenient that it's new and there's new things we've got to focus on, but convenient in that it's called the single assessment framework because it applies for all CQC regulated providers. So the stuff that you're having to do at your practice level, you will also have to do for the PCN itself. And of course, it can't just be a simple copy and paste job, although there will be some overlap, but you can't just lift and shift your policies and maybe change the name from the name of your practice to the PCN. There'll be a little bit more to it than that. One reason why it might be worth you thinking about using the Well-led provider software is that we will help you to make sure you're getting good or outstanding even in the Well-led key question. And the CQC specifically ask in one of their evidence categories that you are getting staff feedback to help evidence their framework. And there's also a CQC regulation that says not only should you be getting the feedback, but that you must also be acting on it. And both of those things, getting the feedback and acting on it, are things that you can do through our platform. And of course, once you are well-led, you will be improving your teamwork, your staff will be happier, recruitment will work better, retention will be better. Your PCN will be more sustainable and resilient, which is what the whole point of the PCN DES was when it was introduced back in 2019. It was to support the network practices. So you'll be in a nice, strong place to do so. I'll quickly talk you through the process of getting that feedback from staff that we've said is so important in terms of evidencing the well-led category and how it works on our platform. So we give you the opportunity to do something called a well-led review for your PCN. Our platform will send out some questionnaires to all of your staff. These are digital, anonymous, quick, easy to complete. And they also give your staff the opportunity to not only say what they think and contribute, but to also give you an idea of what they think the priorities are that you need to be working on so that you can truly say that you're being led by your team. And out of the other end of those questionnaires, you'll get a detailed report where we give you a lot of data about how your staff feel you're doing against all of the well-led criteria, and also all of the things that we know are things that good teams and good leaders should be doing. We also break it down so you get to compare how your leadership team feel you're doing in a certain area compared to how the rest of your staff think you're doing in a certain area. And we give you a benchmark compared to all of the PCNs in our database that have used this review, so that if you score well, you can say that this is great objective evidence for the CQC to show that you are well led. We then suggest areas for improvement based on our analysis of the data and also on what your staff feel are the areas you need to be working on. And we then signpost you through to our library of expert guidance and exercises that you can do and upload to your action plans to show that you are working on the feedback that the staff have given you. And then, of course, you can do another review to show that those improvements have become embedded. This is an example of some of the questions that we would ask a PCN team as part of a well-led review. Are you clear about the PCN's vision and values? Are team meetings effective? Is the line management nice and clear? Is the learning culture from mistakes and significant events as it should be? Do people take responsibility? Are people credible? And are conflicts of interest well handled? It was me with my mediator hat probably putting in that last question, because I come across a lot of PCN conflict work where the conflict has come from a conflict of interest, because often the people who are active in the PCN in making decisions are also those that are active politically and have perhaps positions in the ICB or a federation, that kind of thing. And there on the right hand side are some examples of the types of exercises that we give you to do to improve in the areas that you might want to work on. They're either individual or group exercises. Some last 20 minutes, some last a whole half day. So there's plenty for you to sort of choose from. I won't spend too long talking about our prices. That's between 15 and 20p a year, depending on your list size. And that gives you unlimited access to a platform and the ability to do as many reviews as you like. You can also do them for all of your individuals working in the team, right from the most junior person to the most very senior partner or PCN manager. There's one for everyone on there. And we offer a bit of a bulk discount if you buy it at a PCN level. And we also offer a mock CQC inspection service for those of you that are worried about an upcoming CQC inspection and want to get a little bit ahead of the curve and have a mock one to check that you're meeting all of the areas that you need to be meeting. And now that Well-led provider and MIAB have a partnership together, we can offer any MIAB client 10% off all of those Well-led packages that were on the previous slide. And I know some of you are on this call, if you are already a customer of the Well-led provider, then do contact Gary or I or Gabby or whoever it is from our team that you're familiar with, and we can talk to you about an exclusive offer that MIAB can give to you in terms of insuring either your practice or your PCN. There is a little feedback form here for you to complete, but because you will get the slides through with the recording and everything at the end, you'll be able to click on the links and do it then. But if you want to scan the QR code, please do so. We're really grateful to receive the feedback. And likewise on the feedback, if you've got a question that you haven't thought of now but comes up later, you can put it in there and we will get back to you. But I will now hand over to Gary, who I see has been collating all of the questions and is ready to grill, hopefully not me, but just Monty and Rob with some of the more difficult ones. And the great question that I saw about, should we bother incorporating since the DES is what's going to happen to the DES next year? Gary.
Thanks, Claire. I've got some really good questions actually. So I'm going to start off with some questions for Rob. So are the directors the same number as the partners within a practice, or is it one director per practice? And that question comes from MIAB, a Vanley surgery.
So there's no hard and fast rule on who is the director and the number of directors that you appoint to the business. You've got to remember that the business is an independent entity, and as a consequence, whoever is appointed to a director has legal and fiduciary duties defined by the Companies Act. So they have to make certain that they act in the interest of the company. However, we fully understand that the interest of the company is going to be designed based around the interests of the practices as to who appoints them. The key, therefore, really comes down to working out who are the best people to be added to the board of directors. Probably a representative from each of the practices makes sense, and it's purely from an engagement point it makes sense. But you might also want to consider bringing on some practice management team who could provide the kind of operational support. You might want to consider bringing in financial support. It really does depend on how you see the role of the business developing and how it would kind of almost take on a life of its own without losing its core connection with the practices.
Brilliant. Okay. So, Rob, staying on the theme of the board structure, and I think you've sort of talked a little bit about it there. Surja Chowdhury of High Street Surgery has asked, who can be directors when incorporated? Can practice managers or allied healthcare professionals do this role, or does it have to be GP partners?
So pretty much anyone can be a director. There's a couple of exclusions defined under the Companies Act, but They're very specific, so we won't focus on that. The broader question is, as long as they're eligible under the Companies Act, anybody can. Again, it's a case of designing the board to ensure that it's got the right people who can be empowered to make the decisions to run the business on behalf of the PCN. So if it's, I deal with many incorporated PCNs now, and we often see that they've added, they normally have a couple of GPs representing the interests of the partnerships, the core partnerships. They might have a director or two who are practice managers who bring particular skill sets. It might be, for example, they've got HR specialty, they've got the operational specialty. There's a couple that I work with who've got other members of the clinical staff, because ours workforce is, after all, a very diverse workforce. So it might be beneficial to have a director who understands the obligations and requirements that are in place for each of those types of specialties. Now, the flip side of all of that is, as a general principle, you don't want boards that are too big that they can't make a decision. You need to make certain they are manageable in terms of their size and their capacity. We've seen some where the original board structure was, 30 odd people. You just can't really manage that in. So it's a bit of a nightmare. So you want to make certain who are those who are actually core members with a voting right. Have they got the resources and the ability to do the role? And it might be that you then invite other people in for, to attend meetings, and senior management team members to feedback and update them. But really just think about who are those core decision makers who will be acting in the interests of, well, the shareholders, who in this case would be the practices.
Brilliant. Okay, and the last one for you, Rob. Nasima Abdi from Holmwood Corner Surgery just asked for clarification on a point in your presentation. You referred to services. What kind of services are these?
In all honesty, it could be pretty much anything. The starting point, because we are focusing on PCNs, is the PCN specification. So if you take any part of the specification, you can turn that into a service of some variety. The obvious ones are things like enhanced access that can be defined and standalone, and predating PCNs, that was improved access and had various other headings in the past. So that's a standalone one. You could do your enhanced health and care homes as a service. You could deliver elements of the R's as a service. So instead of having a pharmacist team, you provided a pharmacist service to your practices. Now, I did say I wouldn't touch on VAT in too much detail, but the difference between having a team that's providing a workforce to the practices and having a team that's providing a service to the practices means that should not be subject to VAT as a clinical service. So you can really structure it in many ways, and we are seeing some really innovative ways of working with these entities. So a lot of kind of collaboration-based projects around the capacity and access element, for example. And Monty touched on one of the kind of more extreme sides of it, as we are seeing these entities taking on GMS and APMS contracts where practices have failed, so which is a huge step along that journey of taking on services. But you really does show the potential of what these entities could do. And one last thing before we move on is, if we think about the role of the PCNs within the INTs, the integrated neighbourhood teams, would you have a vehicle that can actually provide services on behalf without having to rely solely on the practices and potentially puts in the risks and the pressures on the practices? Do you have a vehicle that can deliver some of these new innovative work at scale in your neighbourhood team?
Okay, great. Rob, you can relax for a moment. We're going to move on to Monty. There's some questions that are coming in that we'll come to afterwards. But Monty, back into your presentation. So Pam Smith at Kerno Health has asked, does this mean things like ARRS staff are not covered by practice indemnity, or is that only the case where a PCN has chosen to incorporate? And Pam said she was referring to the CNSGP scheme.
Yeah. So in terms of ours roles, as long as they're working within a primary care contract, they will be covered by the clinical negligence scheme. So any kind of injury they cause to a patient, any misdiagnosis that they may do where a patient suffers harm, whether even it's mental stress, that would all be protected by CNSGP. Where those Rs roles may not have some cover is for things which CNSGP will not pick up, which I actually omitted to come to state it in the slides, was wraparound indemnity. So things which are regulatory, fitness to practice, cost of coroner's inquests, and Good Samaritan Acts, those things will not be picked up. So it may be that the underlying practice has a corporate policy. They may still maintain that with the MDU. It may be covered under that. Or if you've got locum staff, I would always ask the locum staff, make it part of the contract. Are you picking up your own regulatory cover? If not, to entice people to work for you, the practice or the PCN might want to set up their own policy as well, just to ensure that they're properly covered.
Okay, brilliant, thanks. And next question, Monty. This is from an unknown user, and I'll just rephrase this slightly. Does your company provide professional indemnity cover like MDU?
No, we don't. Again, professional indemnity is the technical name for it, but the cover that you're actually being provided by the likes of the MDU is really medical malpractice. So medical malpractice in the healthcare domain is professional indemnity. As I was saying in the slides, professional indemnity and medical malpractice are not quite one and the same. Medical malpractice refers to clinical injury, whereas professional indemnity is cover for a professional service. So any financial loss as a result of your professional service. But in this instance, if we're talking about an individual, it's occurrence cover, and this is getting very technical now. If we're talking about comparing it for like, individuals as occurrence cover, we would offer claims made insurance. When it comes to corporate cover, the likes of the MDU would still offer claims made insurance in the same way that we do. But for the purposes of this, if you're referring to primary care work solely, the MDU aren't going to get involved in any kind of clinical indemnity for you anyway.
Okay, that's great. Okay, we've had another question from MIAB, and she's asked, or he's asked, can PCN funds be used to cover the extra insurance costs?
Sorry, Gary, I didn't quite hear that. Could you say that?
Okay, yeah. So I think this is probably a question for Monty, but Rob, you may have a view on it. Can PCN funds be used to cover the extra insurance costs?
I think that's one for Rob.
Okay.
Yeah, I do have a view on this. Unsurprisingly, for those of you who know me, with all of these, the liability sits on the company. We're talking about an incorporated vehicle, so that vehicle must have the insurance that's required. Therefore, it must be able to fund that requirement. This then comes down to a question of, well, what is the financial envelope that's going to be funding some of these kind of improvements? Now, the DES services, DES specification, there isn't much money in it. It's not a huge pot that would go a long way, but there are some core costs that need to come out of it. And if you think about probably the most potentially profitable element of the contract is the enhanced access, that might therefore you need to use some of that money to cover the overheads such as your insurance costs. Ultimately, you do need to make certain the books balance after all. So being able to identify what those costs are at the start of setting up the entity is really important, so that you've got the financial planning, the budgeting, and ultimately the financial governance to ensure that the business is viable moving forward. I hope that's answered the question.
Yeah, and interestingly, Tom Watson's just added in the chat, which I think is really helpful. We used PCN development funds in 23-24 to support incorporation and insurance costs. So there's somebody telling us what they've been able to do. Staying with you then, Rob, Gemma Cooper from Yale Medical Centre has asked, given the fact that we currently don't know what will happen to PCNs in 25-26, is it worth incorporating at this time?
Oh, it's a great question, isn't it? So I hope you're all ready for the next 2 hours.
Well, I've already sort of said we're going to be following the full stock take in some form or another. PCNs are here to stay. But Rob, go on. I fully
agree. There might be some sort of rebranding. There might be some sort of particularly if a new government is elected, which depends, without getting into the politics of it, does seem likely. The chances are they'll want to put their own spin on it. But if we look, so in which case I always say, let's bring it back to the absolute core basics of what the principle of a PCN is. And there are two elements to it. The first is practice resilience. How can practice resilience be improved? And the second is integrating primary care into wider services in a way that hasn't always been successful in the past. And the only way they can do that is by offering a degree of it at scale. So that's whether that's with INTs, with your community services, with new contracts coming out. A lot of, for example, the services that were done as enhanced services at a local level, some of the old kind of treatment room type services, they are no longer going to be awarded out on an individual contractual basis. They'll be kind of given out on a PCN wide basis. So that's what we're seeing. That's unlikely to change. So the question is, how do you want to do that as a group of practices? And potentially, and it will depend on the specific circumstances you are in, but potentially having your own vehicle that can deliver those services at scale is a route to delivering that. So my view is very much, as you've just said, Gary, is that I do see the benefit of having a vehicle, whether you call it an incorporated PCN or something else, that your practices can share to deliver these at scale moving forward.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, and Gemma's given us a follow-up question to this as well, that I think again for you, Rob, what are the approximate costs for an average PCN to incorporate?
Okay, so we'll start at the simple level, which is setting up a company, assuming that it's not too complicated, it's not overly, you don't have really complex articles of association, for example, which are the rules governing your company. If you've got that type of arrangement, it costs a couple of £1,000s to set a company up. I think what you then need to do is look at what are the additional costs above that. And I sometimes find that these are the bits that get overlooked a bit, and that's been such as make certain you've got the subcontracts in place, make certain you've got the staff TUPE undertaken, make certain you've got the insurance put in place. All of that does add up, and again, it's very specific on your actual circumstances. But I think if you budget somewhere in the region of, if you feel like you can do it fairly quickly, then you probably want a budget of between 2,500 to 5,000 to get started, and then depending on the level of complexity and the difficulties that you might have with staffing, contracting, novation of existing contracts, you might be looking at closer to 7 to 10. But it really does depend on your circumstances, where you currently are, how you're going to map it going forward, and ultimately the appetite for incurring the cost from professionals, because you might actually have a very good workforce that can do a lot of it anyway. If you've got practice managers who've gone through multiple practice mergers, for example, they've probably got the core skills and just need a bit of guidance. That really helps.
Brilliant, thank you. This next question, probably for you, Monty, is we were told that we didn't need additional CQC cover. We've moved to a limited company. Do we need additional cover? And that's from A.D. Salter at Fountain Medical Practice.
I would probably suggest yes, but we'd probably need to understand what that business is doing, who they're actually employing, what services they're undertaking. It's hard to actually comment on that without speaking to them individually.
Okay, and everybody's invited to have a conversation with you, Monty, about these questions then, I'm guessing.
Definitely, 100%.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gary, I that question, I do wonder if it was, if it might be the way it was phrased, because I actually read it slightly differently as saying whether or not they needed CQC registration, but I might have misinterpreted that. But I wonder if we could cover that question as well.
Yeah, do that. Rob, do you want to answer that then?
Yeah, fine. Just in case. I mean, the answer is, it again depends on which way you've structured your company. If you are providing any level of hands-on care through the entity, then you do need CQC registration. If you are holding a contract, you know, or doing it as a cost sharing group, then you might not need to. But you have to be very careful. I know a lot of people that have received advice on the principles of setting it up to avoid VAT, etc., but then didn't necessarily ask the next question about, actually, are you planning to deliver services? And we get quite a few instructions come through from entities that have gone one route and then actually realise they needed a different route because actually they are, you know, doing enhanced access, for example, in which case you do need your CQC registration.
Right, thanks, Robin. I think you did actually interpret it correct looking at the chat. Right, we've got some extras that have been added. So I was wanting to come to this one from a Duncan Green. What benefits do a well-led practice / PCN have on insurance risks? I think that's one for you, Monty.
The benefits are you've got one point of contact. Obviously, it's exclusive to the market, the actual offering that we've got. So, as I said, you normally, for this type of cover, you'd have a multitude of policies. You may have a minimum of 5 or 6. So you would only have one policy in this instance. It's with an A-rated insurer, very, very secure. You're dealing with experts who understand the type of business that you actually are. The whole policy itself was actually, we've done the market research behind it. And the fact of the matter, it's a policy which has actually been put together specifically off the back of a PCN. So that's what I would say was the main benefits. And you can actually tailor it to yourself as well. You don't need, whilst I've recommended that you take all the cover, there are varying limits within that cover as well. So depending on your size, you might not need £500,000 worth of management liability cover. You may only need £250,000 worth. Similarly, you might want to increase the cover that you get for the HR side of things. So it's actually flexible as well. I know we've spoken about the fact that PCNs may change in 2025. Obviously, from the last 18 months, we've seen PCNs come on board who've started out really, really small, undertaking hardly no services, and they've simply grown over the last 18 months. So the policy's been able to grow with them. So that's what I would say the benefits are at the moment.
Yeah, that's great. I certainly believe that, you know, well-run, well-managed, well-led practices and businesses, less risk normally is the way. Now, we've got some questions to go through. We may run out of time to cover all of these. So if we don't cover them, we will try and follow up and, you know, cover on email. So, but let's carry on, see how we do. Rob, back to you. If other than GP partners are directors, what would be their legal or other liabilities? Also, when it comes to voting, who would they be? Last bit, but yeah. Anyway,
so the first, in terms of the first part of the question, liabilities as a director of a standalone PCN company are exactly the same regardless of your background and your role outside of the business. Directors have limited liability, but they do have various obligations they must comply with, which can result in them being held responsible for failings within the business. There are particular risks associated with taxation, for example, and financial governance. However, as a general rule of thumb, they don't have any additional, you know, significant liabilities that would make them personally liable. By having it as a GP partner, of course, though, you have that ability to kind of link it with their partnership, which then makes it a bit more personal. So you could argue that there is a benefit of having that, for want of a better tone, you know, kind of skin in the game element of being a director who is a GP partner. I'm not 100% certain about the voting question, but I think as a general principle, all directors are appointed to be directors. It doesn't matter what title they're given, they are directors of the business. Therefore, they all have the same vote as each other if they are a proper executive director that's been appointed appropriately in accordance with the Articles and the Companies Act.
Right. We're probably best to call it the end of the questions there. Claire, I'll hand back to you as people are dropping off.
Thank you. And just to reiterate what Gary said, the ones that we haven't come round to, I think there was one about perhaps a minimum number of directors and chorusing and that sort of thing. We'll pick that up afterwards if we can. But there's also the opportunity to put your questions that you might have afterwards into our feedback form, and we'll answer them then as well. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to Hempsons and Rob and MIAB and Monty and Gary for doing a great job with the sharing of the questions. I hope it was informative and useful, and we hope to run another one later in the year if we get positive feedback from you. So do tell us your thoughts and tell other people about us if you are so inclined. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you all.